On the show today, Steven Kotler. So Steven is Mr. Flow. I have had a strong interest in this topic before I even know what it was called. I did a few seasons snowboarding and I was like, why do I like this so much? Why do I keep getting up early even when I'm hungover to drag my ass out into the cold? And the same with martial arts, most listeners know about my Aikido background. Why did I spend so much time doing something that wasn't really necessary from a practical point of view? But yeah, I got a feeling from I didn't get anywhere else. And so, I've been interested in this literature for a while. And Stephen's books, The Rise of Superman, for example, I really liked. He's got a new one coming out called The Art of the Impossible. And someone really recently said to me, why did you do this big, huge 500,000 conference? And I said, well, I'm not really interested in the possible. So I wanted something that was impossible. And there's a kind of a macho thing to say, but there's some truth in that. It kind of excited me that there's something that was a huge challenge that we had to be sort of superhuman in a way to pull it off. And Steven was at the conference. His presentation was, really eloquent, really well thought of. So very happy to have him back today. So Steven, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Let's hear a bit about your personal story. How did you personally get interested in flow?
I walked into the door of journalism. I was a writer, and I got into magazine journalism in the early 1990s. And back then, action sports were just getting going. So snowboarding, skiing, the like, and gravity games were happening, and the X Games were just starting to get going. And there weren't a whole lot of journalists around who, this was back at a time these sports were really subcultural. So there weren't a lot of journalists around who could actually surf and write or, ski and write, and I could do those things, not very well, but I was lucky enough to spend the better portion of about a decade chasing professional action sport athletes around mountains and across oceans. And what I saw during that period was astounding. There were more so-called impossible feats, things that had never been done and were believed to never going to be done, being done, that like, it was just mind-bending. I mean, the examples are everywhere. At the start of that period, the biggest jump anybody thought a skier could handle or a snowboarder could handle was 70 feet. They thought the human body, that was the upper threshold for impact. And, it's now closing in on 300 feet. Right, the double backflip or the single backflip on a motorcycle. Nobody, right? This has been a forever thing. Surfing a wave over 25 feet people have been trying to do this for almost 1,000 years, and yet 2 decades later, surfers are routinely pulling into waves that are 100 feet tall, right, 100 plus at this point. And so more impossible was going on in these sports than ever before, and I wanted to know why. And really, what caught my attention, it wasn't just that I was seeing the impossible being accomplished over and over and over again. It's that action adventure sport athletes, especially in the early 1990s, were this like rowdy, irreverent punk rock group of people. There was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of crazy behavior. There was very little education, right? The people I knew had very little education. They had very little money. Most of them came from horrific childhoods, broken homes, bad situations. These are people that everybody in the world would have bet against. Like, who's going to fail? These people, right?
That was me and my friends. Yeah.
Right? And yet here, these same people were redefining the limits of our species over and over and over again at a rate that had been unmatched in history. And I wanted to know what the hell was going on. I was dying to understand it. I should also tell you that personally, if you spend all your time chasing pro athletes around mountains and across oceans, you're not a pro athlete. I'm a writer. You're going to break things. I broke everything, like 70 broken bones along the way. And so I knew after a bunch of years in this, sort of as I was pushing towards my 30s, that if I didn't take this question of how do you accomplish the impossible, which had become sort of the central focus of my life, out of action sports and into other domains, I was going to probably kill myself. So like, that's essentially what I did over the next 30 years. As I took this question of 20 years, what does it take to accomplish the impossible, into, science, into technology, into culture, into on and on and on and on. And I wrote books about what I discovered. So that's essentially like my life in a nutshell is, I'm just a guy who's weird enough to think that there's a formula for impossible, and to use the tools of psychology and neuroscience to try to track it down for 30 years and write books about what I discovered along the way.
And you're incredibly well read as well. I mean, I was listening to your Sounds True presentation, and you're jumping between sort of Nietzsche and,
Yeah.
things. And I'm like, wow, like this is psychology is my field, and I'm just about trying, James, William James, and all these kind of historical figures in the flow world, and then bringing that right up to date with kind of cognitive neuroscience and whether the prefrontal cortex is offline when people are doing this. I mean, there's a huge spectrum in what you write about.
There is. I would, yes, and I like. And to take it one step further, anytime you see the impossible become possible, I always say you see two things, right? You see people learning how to take advantage of accelerating disruptive technology, and people learning how to extend human capability. So I've written 6 books on the technology side and 6 books on the human capability side. And as you pointed out, I have a background in philosophy. I mean, a long time ago, a minor, it's not a huge background in philosophy, but and if you want to start studying modern peak performance, the story starts with Nietzsche. I do a little bit of this. I tell the story out loud in the audiobook you listen to, and in The Art of Impossible, you get a little bit of that story actually in print. But like, people don't realize this, but Nietzsche was the first guy. Psychology was just happening. Evolution happened, right? And Darwin came along and gave us a theory of, here's how life develops based on biology. And Nietzsche and a bunch of other people said, hey, wait a minute. Like, if our bodies evolve, our minds evolve too. And if we're going to understand and optimize, Nietzsche was very interested in peak performance and optimizing our psychology. We have to start with biology. And so I start with Nietzsche because that's, it's 150 years later at the Flow Research Collective, which is the company I run. That's exactly what we do, right? We train about 1,000 people a month using a neuroscience-based peak performance training. And the only thing we do is teach people to get the biology to work for them rather than against them. So you start the story with Nietzsche because I think that's sort of where it starts. But yeah, I like the full story. I've read a lot. So do you want the rude version of this? This is the rude version.
You can.
Here's the rude version of this.
The full rude version.
Smart people have a word for people who don't read books. Dumb.
I was gonna go for muggles, but yeah.
Right. Dumb. I mean, that's just the flat truth of the matter. I mean, like, I wasn't all that. I didn't have a lot of natural tools. I didn't come into this world with a ton of talent, and so. But what I learned is I could outread the competition, and I could learn more than other people by simply reading more books.
Interesting.
I learned early on they hide it in books.
So on the one hand, you've got these, this pursuit of a very experiential, very, I was around snowboarders a couple of winters, and not a lot of reading necessarily going on, a lot of partying. A lot of experience, a lot of like, hey, you've got to taste it. It's in the experience, it's in the subjective. But then on the other hand, you've got the kind of other piece of the objective research, the kind of literature around it, the philosophy behind it. So this kind of bringing together two things that aren't always coexisting there.
It is true. It is true. I, take the story one step further to go where you started. I very quickly realized that the state of flow, right, the optimal state of consciousness, was what was underpinning all these impossible feats. Like, when we talk about extending human capability, we're talking about a suite of tools, right? It's not just flow, but flow is at the center of all of it, because flow is optimal performance, right? It's when we feel our best, when we perform our best. It's how evolution shaped human beings for peak performance. It's universal. We can all do it, right? It's so to understand flow, you want more flow. The psychologists, no disrespect, had a rough time of it. Trying to use the psychology to train flow. If you go back to the sort of 1990s, right, there's a literature of this, and it's hit or miss. We're not very good at it. We get better at it in the 2000s because the neuroscience gives us mechanism, right? If you understand how it works in the brain, you have basic biological mechanism. You turn it up, you turn it down. It's a whole lot more to work with. It makes training flow more reliable. That's where the neuroscience sort of came in. So like, there was the only way I could make sense of what these men and women were doing in action sports was through the neuroscience. Now, as a journalist, I had an advantage in that I was also covering science, right? Those were my twin loves, was science and technology and action sports, basically. So I covered everything. I mean, I wrote the music column for GQ magazine for 5 years and blah, blah. I did a lot of stuff, but like my principal loves were science and action sports. So you're right.
You're kind of like, I read often your work here as sort of like someone who's pretty geeky, but also has an ear for the sexy, like adventure sports. You know, it's pretty attractive. I mean, it's not quite as cool as it once was. It's a bit more common, but it's pretty sexy. It's pretty exciting. And even neuroscience is kind of, you know, it's kind of the sexy mind crack of kind of a lot of coaches and trainers I know out there. You know, a lot of Buddhists now, meditation friends of mine, tell them about neuroscience. They kind of light up. You show them a blob of a brain with a blob of color on, and they're convinced by anything. You know, there's even a word for that, blobology. And you know, you do have, let's like Steven, I don't want to give you shit here, but let's be honest, you do have a pretty like an ear for the sexy as well, right?
Well, I don't think of it that way. So let me put it to you. I have a very good talent for finding the cutting edge of any situation. There's a lot of shit I can't do. So like, let me put this, like when I was in school, if you gave me, I'm an English major. I have an English major as an undergraduate. I have a really hard time understanding most of the classics of literature. Like literally, like you put give me a Thomas Hardy book or something along those lines.
It's boring. Thomas Hardy's boring.
Right. But if you give me James Joyce or Thomas Pynchon or David Foster Wallace, my brain works that way. I naturally understand that stuff. That's how my brain sort of is. And so that's sort of a cutting, that's just a nose for the cutting. I call it a nose for the cutting edge and wherever I am. It's just what works for me. It's not, so I'm not trying to be sexy. And in fact, the way I tell it to my team when you know, we have to do a lot of, you know, we do PR, we do marketing, we do all that stuff. And I said, look, I need you guys around because I'm a guy who can't find the mainstream with two hands and a flashlight. Like I have no idea where the rest of the world is. Before I teamed up with Peter Diamandis and he pointed me in the direction of the world. I had written 4 cult classics in 4 different genres. Do you know how impossible that is? Like, do you know how just crazy that is? I missed the mainstream. I mean, trust me, I was trying to sell as many books as possible. I missed the fucking mainstream 4 times in 4 different directions.
I don't believe you 100%. You're a great salesman, You tell, and I don't mean that as an insult. Like
I am a great salesman now.
Okay.
After 35 years of having people around me pointing me where I need to go, I was, you know, I fell into magazine journalism because I had dreadlocks down to the middle of my butt and, you know, as an old punk rocker, and nobody would fucking hire me in mainstream corporate world. You know what I mean?
I'd hire you now.
No, but I mean, like I was working, before I went to grad school in writing, I was working at Foot Cone and Belding, advertising, right? Cool, cutting edge advertising shop back in the 90s. I was doing some freelance stuff. They'd never met me. I got out of grad school thinking I was going to walk right back into a job there. And I had to go into the office to fill out forms this time. And they took one look at me. And I'm like, yeah, if I could forget about it. So like, you know, at the time, magazine journalism was sort of the only place that would have me.
You were hiding behind that. And okay. So let's do the very basics. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the basics because, you know, listeners can find your stuff online. We want to cut to the advanced stuff. But what is flow? You said optimal state of peak performance. Is it a
Yeah, let me give you a slightly more workable definition for your listeners. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're good. What is flow? How do we get into it? Let's hit the basics first.
Yeah, basics. Flow, as I said, is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best, we perform our best. More specifically, any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption when there's complete concentration on the task at hand and everything else just seems to disappear. So action awareness will start to merge. Your sense of self will get very, very quiet. Time will dilate. Fancy way of saying it, passes strangely. It speeds up. 5 hours go by in 5 minutes, or sometimes it'll slow down. You'll get that freeze frame effect from anybody who's been in a car crash. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. And the list of what flow optimizes, just so you guys understand, we're talking about a lot of stuff, is motivation, productivity. McKinsey did a 10-year study. They found top executives are about 500% more productive in flow. So self-reported, whatever, but 500% is a huge boost. Work done by the US Army shows learning accelerates about 240%. Soldiers in flow were learning like target acquisition skills and things like that, 240% faster than normal. Creativity and work we did and work that was done at Harvard, the University of Sydney, a couple other places, creativity and innovation will go 400 to 700%. You got a bunch of other stuff as well. We could talk about why and where that list comes from.
It makes you fucking awesome, basically.
But it makes you fucking awesome, basically. And so here's the simple version of how do you get more of it, right? Flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. Flow follows focus. That's what all these triggers do. Flow only shows up when all of our attention is in the right here, right now. That's the gateway. So that there are 22 known triggers. There's probably way more, but people have discovered 22 of them. And all of them do one of three things. They drive dopamine into our system. They drive norepinephrine into our system. These are both focusing chemicals, right? They're happy reward drugs as well. But when dopamine and norepinephrine are in our system, for example, we put them together. That's the cocktail known as romantic love, right? So think about how much attention you'd pay to somebody you're in love with, right? That's what that cocktail gives you. Or they lower cognitive load, which all the shit you're trying to think about at any one time. I lower that, liberates more energy. You can use it for attention. So that's what all the triggers do. And literally these triggers can be like novelty, complexity, unpredictability, risk, or insight, right? When we link ideas together, all these things produce dopamine. We encounter something novel in the world, dopamine spikes. We encounter something unpredictable, dopamine spikes. We encounter complexity, like the overwhelming of complexity of a night sky, or the geographical time of the Grand Canyon. You look at a canyon, you're like, oh my God, that's what a million years looks like, right? That's complexity. Unpredictability, complexity, novelty, all these things produce dopamine. You want to drive flow. These are some of your tools that you reach for. They're psychological tools that get us more flow. Why did action sports go so freaking crazy in the 90s? Because action sports are built around most of flow's triggers. And especially in the 90s, they started putting creativity. It was no longer fastest man or woman to the bottom is the winner. It was the most creative line to the bottom. That means a line filled with novelty, complexity, unpredictability, and insight, linking ideas together. Oh, I can use that little curve like a fin, and I can launch a flat spin, blah, 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 right? So you had the crank got turned on all that stuff, but it's not just skiing. It's any innovation incubator.
Okay,
Seattle,
let me jump in. Let me jump in with a couple of things. So, it feels great. It makes you awesome at whatever you're doing. It's highly addictive because it's motivating in and of itself. Which is why the people get up early for the snowboarding, or do the aikido even if their knees are smashed from it or whatever. But it improves performance across a wide range of things. Is it one state that has a scale? Like I've heard you talk about micro.
Yeah, it's a good
or
question.
Is it a sort of bucket for a bunch of different states that are just, this is some cool stuff that humans get into?
There's two, there's two answers to this question. First of all, it's a spectrum, right? Flow is like any emotion. You can be a little irked or homicidally murderous. It's still anger, right? You can be in a state of so psychologically, flow has 6 core characteristics. We name them: complete concentration in the present moment, time dilation, vanishing of self, merger of action awareness, a couple more. When psychologists measure flow, they say, hey, how much of these 6 things showed up in an experience, right? So you can have all 6 can show up, but they can be like tuned to 1 or 2. This is, you sit down to write that quickie email and you get sucked in by something and an hour goes by and you don't notice, and maybe your sense of self didn't disappear, but when you pop back into consciousness, you're like, oh crap, I got to go to the bathroom. So you forgot your body, right? That's micro flow. Macro flow is what shows up more frequently in action sports. It's like all those 6 things turned up to 11, right? Time slows down as you jump off the cliff and blah, blah, blah. Right.
It's being a bit overused as a word, I'm finding now. People are talking about.
They talk about all kinds of crazy stuff. And by the way, when I define flow, I don't even define it by the psychology. I define it by, hey, we see these foundational changes in neural dynamics. These are the signals that correlate to flow. That's how I define the state. But I want to answer your question one step further. There's a guy named Christian Swan in Australia, and he's a psychologist, smart dude. Does really interesting flow work and sports psychology. And he's identified a state he calls clutch, that is a sub-flow state. He says, let's say you're a golfer, right? And you're in flow up through like hole 16, and on hole 16, your caddy turns to you and goes, dude, if you par the next 2 holes, you're going to win the tournament. He says that that is a second state where you turn your goals up and it's a little more conscious than flow. Flow is almost a very unconscious state, right? Everything's automatized. So I don't think Christian's right. at all in this particular thing, but I can't prove that yet to you using the neurobiology. So I can't give you a definite answer. So like there, you gave you my answer, and then there's another guy, Christian Swan, who has a slightly different answer. But
and a key piece that I've got again and again from your work, which has been really helpful for me personally in my work, is this idea of the balance between challenge and capability. So for example, I've done a lot of martial arts. So if I was kind of in a sparring situation, I'd have enough skill and enough challenge. If it got bored, if the sparring partner was not experienced enough, it would be too easy. I wouldn't get that state of flow. Or if there was 3 guys with baseball bats, it would be too hard. And again, I wouldn't get that. I'd just be in fear and panic. I wouldn't be in that state of flow. So if I understood that right, that kind of balance between those 2 things is key.
That's the most, you asked me earlier, how do you get more flow? That's the most important flow trigger, is the challenge skills balance. So basically, we pay the most attention to whatever it is that we're doing when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set, right? As you pointed out, you want to stretch, but you don't want to snap. Yeah. So you, like anything you do, I go skiing, I sit down to write, I go to the gym to train, whatever it is, I want to push just to the edge of my abilities and a little bit farther. Where this gets tricky, meek or shyer people have a problem here, because this sweet spot is definitely right outside your comfort zone, right? Yes. So you got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And for peak performers, like hard charging type A types, it's they take huge challenges, right? Like I used to do this. I'll bite off a challenge that is, 500, 600, 1,000% bigger than my skills, simply for the thrill of it. Yep. And the literature says, hey, that's fantastic. Like a high hard goal gives you an 11 to 25% boost in motivation simply for setting the goal. That's huge, man. That's like 8-hour day is your baseline. That's like getting 2 free hours of work simply for having the right goal built around what you're doing. So that's just dumb. If you don't do that, you're right. But set those higher goals, just chunk them down. So what it is that you're doing right here, right now is just outside your comfort zone.
As a manager, I applied this principle during the conference by giving people things to do that were a bit harder than they thought they could do. But I kind of had faith in them, they could do it, and they weren't massively overwhelmingly harder. Like I was trying to keep people in that spot of like, shit, this is hard, but I think I can do it. Like I'm right on the edge of my capability. That's the
sweet spot. That's exactly it. Yeah, that's it. I mean, you're nailing it, right? That's a good flow-based experiential design.
Okay, so let's talk about the dark side of this, because I'm someone that's got an addictive background. I'm long-term sober. In some ways, one of the reasons I think I didn't get addicted to snowboarding was I was already alcoholic at the time. And though it competed at one point, like there was a sense of like, oh, maybe this is worth giving up drinking for. And I also saw people that were utterly addicted to the rush of snowboarding and martial arts, to the point where they got divorced, they wrecked their bodies physically, they pushed themselves. No other area of life meant anything to them. And it looked to me like drugs by other means. Obviously, it's
so it is
you're inventing your own your own pharmacy, right?
I mean, so let's talk about the there's a bunch of different neurochemicals involved in flow, but 6 of them: dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, endorphins, and anandamide. Those are the big neurochemicals that flow. So each of these are internal chemicals, right? They're reward chemicals. The brain uses them to reward behavior that helps us survive. So we'll do the thing and do it again. Reinforces learning, does a bunch of stuff. These are the 5 biggest reward chemicals the brain can produce. And they all have a street drug version, right? Like all street drugs do is bind to the same receptors that these chemicals work on. If you were to cocktail flow on the street, literally,
give me a business idea, Steven. That was my first job.
No, I mean, look at it though. It's cocaine, speed, ecstasy or LSD, depending on the pathway it takes in the brain. That's serotonin. Anandamide is marijuana, and endorphins are opiates. And to just give you an idea, there are about 20 different endorphins in the brain. The most common is 100 times more potent than medical morphine. So like our internal drugs are better, and even better than that, you can't cocktail those street drugs, as you probably know.
No,
right?
Without dying.
You're right. Not without dying or without, right? Like you can't do it. So our internal drugs are better, but as you pointed out, massively addictive, massively addictive. So there's an upside and a downside with flow. The upside is like Dan Harris wasn't wrong in his book, like 10% happier. Like you can use sort of the tools of positive psychology to get a 10% boost in life. Flow is huge. It's 500%, it's 250%. It's like these crazy, crazy numbers, but there's a downside. Like you have to be an adult when you play with flow. You're playing with the most addictive neurochemistry on earth. And people don't want to come down from flow. So you remember on the Pro Surf Tour a couple of years back, there were all those speed deaths, people getting addicted to meth and dying. They would surf and then they'd be in deep flow and they wouldn't want to come down. So they would start using meth to stay up and party and chase that same feeling. And the end result was a lot of destruction along the way. That's not uncommon. The other side of it is we do a lot of work with, for example, military people, ex-military, right? You're a U.S. Special Forces, you're a Navy SEAL, high flow job, right? Suddenly you're not, you have a real problem, right? You're coming down from a very significant addiction.
Yes.
And just the same. But I will tell you, there's a bunch of treatment programs that use action sports as a treatment for addiction now. And for this very reason, it's also why you can use flow to treat PTSD. It can override these things. And this is work that was done. I wrote about it in Stealing Fire, right? The use of flow as a prophylactic and as a symptom reliever for PTSD. Huge study with like a couple thousand soldiers done in Camp Pendleton.
I guess the thing that concerns me a little bit is that on the one hand, you could say this is ethically neutral technology, like, fire is, all technology is in a way. In that, this could be used to teach, military who are doing things that I might ethically disagree with very strongly. This could be, there's one side of it. The other side of it is the state itself, to me, and tell me if I'm wrong here, doesn't seem to involve contribution or ethics as a trigger. So what I saw when I was around extreme athletes.
What do you mean by contribution?
Making other people's lives better, contributing to others.
So you're totally wrong there. One of the most powerful flow states is known as helper's high.
Sure, is that integral to it? Is that integral to flow? I mean, I know that's a state.
And more than that, flow. So flow amplifies a bunch of the things that we talked about. It also is one of the only things over time that actively increases empathy and actively expands our perception for the natural world and our ability to see other people's sides of things. But it's not automatic. It seems like you've got to do some of the adult development work, right? Like flow gives us access to this stuff, and it will make you more appreciative of nature over time, and it will make you more empathetic over long periods of time, right? But you definitely have to do the work. So it works towards our benefit, but you are right. It's a neutral tool. And if you, so Naval Hariri, who wrote Sapiens.
Yeah. Hello.
Oh, you're absolutely correct about that stuff.
Okay, so I want to dig into this a little bit more because I find it fascinating. So if I think of the kind of flow junkies that I've known, they were pretty like into the natural world, spending a lot of time having a sense of oneness while you're in the Swiss Alps does tend to give you an appreciation for nature, So I kind of get the natural world when I buy that. Were they more empathic? They were generally pretty chill. They weren't violent people or mean people. But there was something a little sort of self-interested in them. Like they were mostly interested in chasing their own state.
Chasing the high. Yeah. So
you
get
building a better world.
You do get some bliss junkie-dom associated with it. And so here's the other question though. Like you make a fair point, but those people were also, I'm guessing, mostly in their 20s, which is what you were.
Pretty young.
Right?
Yeah.
So right. So how do you 20s are a fairly selfish decade, you know what I mean? Or at least they have been, especially when you and I were in our 20s kind of thing, a little while ago. So that's a little bit part of it, I think. So I think there's a bunch of confounding factors. I don't think you're wrong, but that doesn't, I don't know if you know this or not, but psychologists now define happiness by 3 tiers of happiness in this world. There's tier 1, which is happiness, how you feeling right here, right now. Tier 2 is engagement and enjoyment. That's a high flow lifestyle. And tier 3 is meaning and purpose, which is a high flow lifestyle where the thing that is producing the most flow is tied to a cause greater than yourself. So that's the best we get to feel on the planet. Flow is a direct part of the definition, and it's baked into meaning and purpose. You don't get real meaning and purpose often without a lot of flow.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I these days, the place I most get flow is teaching. I mean, that's the thing I've done most, is teaching workshops, teaching classes, well over 10,000 hours of that. I actually had one instance where I was teaching with an interpreter. She was a Russian young lady, and she got caught in the same sort of bubble, is almost how it was. And she wasn't used to flow because she'd never done any extreme sports or whatever. And afterwards, she sort of said, "What the hell was that?" You know,
she was on stage with you and hadn't been on stage before, and she got, yeah. That's
like
great.
Teaching with me, translating as I taught, and kind of got caught in it. And she was like, it was like the last 2 hours just disappeared. And I was like, oh, that's good. That happens sometimes. We probably just taught a great class. I'll have to see the video afterwards, because it's just that time went by. And
I mean, always a good sign that you did good on stage if you have no idea what the hell you said. Right?
what they just say? They're clapping. Cool. Let's talk about it in some of the sort of less, extreme kind of places then. So let's talk about writing. We both write. How do you get in flow when you're writing, when you, you can't kind of push it in this extreme adrenaline?
Oh, that's not true. That's not true at all. So I'll tell you, let's start with the challenge skills balance. So I know that if I have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm coming in cold to a subject, I can write 500 words or 350 words about the subject easy. Like it's one idea, right? I'll have one idea and that'll give me about one idea. If I want to write 500 words, I usually have to draw a bridge to a second idea. I got to do so 500 words is about outside of my comfort zone, just stretching. So when I start a book, my goal is to write 500 words a day. By the middle of the book, I'm writing 750 to 900 words a day. And by the end of it, I'm writing 1,200 or 1,500 words a day or so. Right. That's my challenge skills sweet spot. And it moves, it changes, but I do that. Like that's my goal. That's how I structure my days. Right. I have a checklist of what I'm going to do in my day. And I know exactly what target, like how's it going to feel when I hit that sweet spot. And that's how I steer through everything I do.
And it's not sort of physically dangerous, but there can be that sense of like,
so let me take it
for the publisher.
Let me take it one step further. Insight, the linking of ideas together is a flow trigger. So what I always do is I start my writing session by editing what I wrote the day before. Why? Because editing, when you have insights along the way with editing, it's usually a pattern recognition. Oh, this isn't the right word here, but if I drop this word in the rhythm of the sentence, that's all pattern recognition. That's all dopamine every time you recognize one of those things. So you get a bunch of dopamine hits in a row, you're really starting to drive towards flow. So I start my writing session. I edit first because the experience of insight is likely to drive me closer to flow. And so then when I get to the blank page, I'm a little closer to the zone. My brain is working a little bit better. And then when I'm approaching the blank page, I know, 500 words, right? Edit what I did yesterday in 500 words. That's like, I have a 4-hour writing session every morning. That's how I start every one of my days. And that's exactly how I style it out. And it's specifically built. And by the middle of the book, in those 4 hours, I do 750, words. Same thing. And it's totally dialed. Now, everybody's challenge skills sweet spot is going to be different, right? And it could change for different projects, right? When I'm writing neuroscience papers for science journals, I'm sure as hell not writing 750 words a day, right? I'm writing like 4 sentences if I'm lucky sometimes, but
So you think it's sort of any job you can, you don't have to be a snowboarder, any job.
You have to remember that one of the most common incidences of flow on the planet is group flow, interpersonal flow, 2 people talking between middle managers at work. Right. I mean, you got to think about, they deal with money. So there's risk, right? They solve unpredictable, novel problems for big companies that are complex, right? They need insight to do it. And there's group flow, and there's a bunch of group flow triggers that they usually use if they're good communicators, right? So this is really common. So one of the things that people don't realize is we spend way more time in microflow than we know, but most people, like that woman you talk about, they don't know what flow is. They haven't really learned to identify it. So they don't realize they're in microflow, and they don't realize they could turn up the volume in specific ways, introduce more triggers, and move it towards macro flow. Right. And, as I said, we train about 1,000 people a month, and I will say 80% of them fall into one of 2 categories. They're either a C-suite executive, usually burned out, usually a peak performer who started to get burned out, or they're usually powerhouse women in their 40s and 50s who have raised a family and now they're going to get back to the thing that they really wanted to do and they want to kill it. Those are the two groups of people we tend to spend the most time with. And neither of them tend to be action sport athletes as a general rule.
So your advice, you're talking to them about this kind of, challenge, and you're talking to them about how to structure their day. You're talking to them about how to work together to get this group flow. What kind of stuff are you training with?
Well, I mean, so The Art of the Impossible, the book that I have coming out in January, is literally everything I've learned, 30 years of peak performance, studying peak performance, those moments when the impossible became possible, turned into an actionable how-to. And it starts with, so if you follow the biology to peak performance, and I'll do this colloquially because it's easier to understand, it starts with motivation. And when I say motivation, I'm actually talking about motivation and grit, right? Motivation is the energy to get in the game, and grit is what sort of keeps you there when the energy runs out. And then you need learning, because that's what allows you to continue to play, right? If you're pushing the challenge skills balance, you got to use your skills to the utmost every day. So you have to keep learning along the way. And then you need creativity, creative problem solving, creative decision making, et cetera, all the creativity skills, because that's how you steer. And then you need flow to turbo boost the entire equation. So what do we train people in? That's the stack. And it always starts with motivation. We start training, you can't even get into the peak performance game if you don't have an external locus of control or a growth mindset. So that's where we start. That's what the biology says. Then once you layer those two things, what the biology says, start with intrinsic motivation. Start with curiosity, turn that into passion, turn passion into purpose. Once you have purpose, you need autonomy, the freedom to pursue your passion. You need mastery, the skills to pursue your passion. And once you've got all that, you layer goals in, because that's how you know where you're going. And once you've got all that, you're starting to produce more flow, which is great, because then you want to start training grit. Right? You shouldn't start training grit until the thing that you're doing is producing more flow, because nobody wants to do the hard work for grit until you're getting the happy juice of flow. But flow is right how you train, and so forth. There's a fixed set of skills, and that's what we're training. So 0 to Dangerous gives you sort of basic intrinsic motivation, goal setting, and the how to use the flow triggers. And there's a flow cycle, so there's a map to the process, blah blah, those kinds of things. That's what we're doing at the front end of it. Goes from there.
It's great to break this down, because often people say, hey Mark, how do you get so much done? And I don't really think it's time management. I think it's something more like, I love what I do, I'm passionate about it, I'm fully engaged in it.
Your biology is working for you. That's what it is. Life is freaking hard, right? That's the whole point. Life is so hard, and it's hard for everyone. Like, trust me, I have met everybody you could possibly meet in the world at all levels, and I've probably lived at all of those levels also. And it's hard for everyone everywhere, foundationally. So anything you can do that makes it easier pushes you towards peak performance. Meaning, if you can get if curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, mastery, your big 5 intrinsic motivators are all pointed in the same direction, what do you get from your motivators? Focus for free. You don't have to think about how much time, energy you waste trying to pay attention to something that you're not into. Right? It's fucking hard, too hard, especially to do day after day after day, because life is hard. So if life is hard and you got to use all this energy to pay attention to shit that sucks, you're not going to be able to pull it off. You can't do it. So you got to dial all that stuff in, point it in the same direction. And then you start getting focus for free, energy for free. And, that's how you get going farther, faster.
Focus for free really resonates with me. I'm fairly ADHD, so's my niece. And what I notice is we can both be really focused on stuff we enjoy. And I wonder if that pushes ADHD people towards flow, because it's just like, for me to do something I have to deliberately spend energy focusing on is just fucking hard work. And the same for my niece, the same for other people I know with ADHD. So I wonder if there's any connection there. Does it push people with ADHD, people sort of push towards more flow?
Yeah. Activity? So I'm probably a little ADHD and a bunch of other, acronyms, shall we say. But we did some work. Why am I going to blank his name? Oh my God. I just forgot the guy who discovered ADHD. We used to do some work with him.
No worries.
I'm blanking his name. I can see his book on the shelf. Anyways, he has said that he thinks ADHD is actually could be an evolutionary adaptation that helps us optimize for flow in a weird way. So people talk about ADHD as a detriment. You know what I mean? I just think all you other motherfuckers are moving too slow.
Yeah, that's what I say.
We are so tired of waiting for you guys to catch up. Right? Like that's
Steven,
my
I love
feeling.
this interview because it's my speed. I love
That's
this
my
interview.
frick. I got one speed, and I am so I agree. I'm waiting for the whole rest of the world to always catch up. I think it's sort of a superpower. But I also let's not kid ourselves. You've been doing this long enough to know that every one of our detriments is our superpowers, right? Those are our superpowers.
Works both ways.
Like,
yeah,
that's the
impulsivity of ADHD
thing.
gets me in trouble. The energy of it maybe is a great superpower. So that everything works both ways, right? So, okay, good. Let's talk a little bit more about the body, as this is the Embodiment podcast. I mean, you said earlier that, and flow can make us not feel the body. So I've had that experience of being really engaged in my work, and not noticing I needed the toilet until I was almost peeing my pants. And then as an embodiment person, I'm like, oh shit, I have all this. But then also, I've also seen that people that have high levels of body awareness, and tell me if this is true or not, seem to enter flow easier. There's a reason yoga's popular.
So one, people with a high level of self-awareness, right? Body, psyche, all of it, to enter more flow more easily. You need self-awareness to do this work. You need to be able to figure out what's going on inside. We also know flow has an embodied trigger. We call it deep embodiment. And Csikszentmihalyi wrote about it originally. Back in the 60s and 70s, he noticed that people could get into flow through bodily activity. Now, let me tell you what is not 100% certain. I talked about how novelty, complexity, unpredictability, and sort of were flow triggers cognitively. What we may call embodiment may actually be the physical version of novelty, complexity, unpredictability, right? Like that. So it may be the same thing, right? You notice a novel sensation, or let me give you a simple example. In skiing, snowboarding, weightlessness is a big flow trigger. And the reason is, right, you jump off something, it's a massive, we're gravity bound creatures. So when you're freaking flying, right, it's a massive, like that. So that will immediately drive a lot of people into flow. Is it the novelty? Is it that physical novelty that's doing it? Or is it something else that's just bodily sensation? Nobody's entirely sure, mostly because I don't think we know how to, deep embodiment is a very this is the sort of cutting edge of neuroscience right now, as you know, and physiology. So do we exactly know how to measure all this stuff yet? No, I don't think we're there, but certainly physical stuff gets us in. It's another reason the action sport athletes had such an easy time getting in. These are totally embodied sports.
Yeah, the physiology that comes with embodied embodied practice pushes one in the direction of flow, which is, I guess, why it's still easier for a snowboarder to get it than an office worker in that sense, because they're physiologically priming themselves, surely, right?
Well, and by the way, if an office worker wants more flow, right, one way to seek it is by picking up some of these embodied sports, right? Because first of all, flow is a focusing skill, essentially. So when you get flow skiing or in the gym or studying martial arts or dancing or any of those things, you're going to get more flow at work because you're training your brain to focus in a specific way. And that's just neuroplasticity and myelination and all that stuff. So there is crossover, provided you can create the same conditions in the work environment that, you know what I mean?
Nice. Have you looked at the connection between adult development, kind of Ken Wilber, Keegan, people like that, and flow? It seems like you're mostly working with state rather than trait. So is it that
I'm not a huge Wilbur fan, because I think he is a little too cult leadery for me and a little too new age spiritual for me in a way that I'm not comfortable with. But I wrote a lot about Keegan's work, and I've done a lot of work on the Harvard Adult Development Project data and all that stuff. Stealing Fire talks about Keegan's work and the Harvard Adult Development Project in particular. So there's interesting work that does say that repeated access to flow will help you move farther, faster up the adult development scale, but you got to still do the homework, right? Like, and the homework, adult development homework is really weird. Like I was talking about this yesterday, like if you haven't figured out how to get paid for what you love by the age of 40, you're kind of screwed thereafter. If you haven't figured out how to forgive all the people who have done you wrong by 50, you're kind of screwed thereafter. Like there are these milestones in development that are really peculiar, and I don't know how they work with flow, but as a general rule, more flow will sort of push you a little farther up the adult development scale. But as you pointed out, shit's not guaranteed. Otherwise, every surfer would be a Buddha. And that's certainly not the case. Not the case. Right, that's not the case.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's often, flow states often seem like a glimpse of higher developmental levels. At least gives me a direction to be aiming for and a taste of something which I can then do the sort of hard work to move towards. That's kind of my sense of it, but I don't have a strong opinion there. Ken's a good guy. Give Ken another chance. He's a good guy.
Okay.
But okay. So
and by the way, it may not actually be Ken. It may be all the people who run around spouting Ken Wilber. Yeah. It's probably like Ken is. You're totally right. Probably it's probably not Ken. He's probably a good guy. And I would probably like him.
He's got a good sense of humor and he's very loving. I like him a lot. And some of the Wilburites need to get laid. That's a fact. So it's
you heard it here first.
That's the truth. Okay, so what surprised you with this new book, with sort of new research you're doing? This stuff's been around a little while now. Like, what surprised you? What's the kind of thing that was like, whoa, I didn't see that coming, or wow, I'm glad I've got a new book coming out so I can put this in.
So let me talk to the two places this book came from, because it's a really good spin-off of what we're doing. So I've been training people in flow a long time. I think there's an argument to be made that nobody has actually done more of this work in the world in terms of training people in flow than I have at this point. And what I started to notice, and this was a while ago, let's say 10 years ago, it turns out if you understand flow's triggers and you understand the map, the flow cycle, you can get dangerous fast. Like I can get a 60, 70, 80% boost in the amount of flow you're experiencing in your life really easily. That's not surprising. But what I discovered is it's really hard for non-peak performers to sustain it. Like when I was training up the Navy SEALs or Olympic athletes or even C-suite executives, they could do this stuff. I would onboard all this shit. They would learn it and they were good to go and they would just go. But most everybody else, there was a substantial return to baseline. They'd get a bunch of flow and then it would they'd plateau, it would drop off, it would get cut off. And when you're dealing with the most addictive state on earth that is really pleasurable and meaningful, right? Let's just say there were some pissed off customers. You know what I mean? Just like not a good plan for a business, right? It's sort of like, here, let me sell you some crack cocaine. And by the way, the supply is cut off in 3 months.
Yeah, I was gonna say, bad,
you know what I mean?
Right there, bad drug.
It's so I took a really long time trying to figure out. I was like, well, what the hell is going on? What is going on? What is going on? And I started to realize it wasn't flow. It was all the things that flow amplifies. Like if you don't have all your motivation, there's 5 big intrinsic motivators. If you don't have them dialed in, there's 6 different grit skills. Literally, biologically, they all seem to need to be trained differently. There's 3 tiers of goal setting, right? There's no more, like it's a fixed set, but like this is what exists. And like if you don't have that shit or learning, we talk for the reason, if you don't know how to learn quickly, right? You just never learn the skills. You don't know how to read books to absorb knowledge, or you don't know how to do the physical things for skill acquisition along the way. Or you don't have a truth filter, right? Like whether it's a scientific method or investigative journalism, like some way of evaluating what you're learning very quickly, all those things, you can't stay in the challenge skills sweet spot, right? And you're going to crash off that cliff. Same thing with creativity. Flow massively amplifies creativity. But dude, if you don't have good creative problem solving, decision-making skills, every tangent seems like a genius idea. And you're going to write like 50 crappy novels before you know what I mean? Like, so I started to realize, I was like, oh my God, like a car going 10 miles an hour, you dent the fender when you hit the tree. But if you're going 100 miles an hour and you hit the tree, you've got a big problem. And that's what was happening. And so I was like, oh, wow, I don't have to just, what was surprising was it just wasn't flow. It's sort of this larger suite. Right. I mean, you know what I mean? I didn't realize how like it was one of those things where you notice a little bit and then you start seeing more of it and you start seeing more of it. And then you're like, oh my God, it's categorical. I can, like, if you going up the flow, getting more flow in your life, getting more flow than life, and it gets cut off, I can literally use this information to be it's a diagnostic. I can tell you where you went wrong and what's missing, blah, blah. So that was sort of huge and surprising, those slow developing. But that's really, I think, one of the things that was at the heart of the work in the book. One of the big surprises. The other one is, and I think you're going to totally appreciate this. This isn't really a big surprise, but it may be surprising to most people. In 30 years of studying this stuff, I have come to the conclusion that not only are we hardwired to go big, but here's the craziest thing. Not going big turns out is really bad for us. So the system is designed to work in a certain way. For example, lining up intrinsic motivation, producing a lot of flow, all the stuff we've been talking about. If you look at the 8 biggest causes of depression, and there are 8 major causes of depression, and then like the next one down, the 9th one is tiny. It's not even really there. 2 of them are trauma and genetics, right? Those are the ones we hear about. The other 6 are literally getting the peak performance equation wrong. If you don't have autonomy, if you don't have lack of meaningful work is one of the major drivers of depression. What is lack of meaningful work? It's a lack of passion, a lack of purpose, lack of autonomy to pursue that purpose, and a lack of flow as a result, right? And so forth and so forth and so forth. So like the shocking thing that sort of came out of this work is the realization at a neurobiological level that not going big is bad for us.
Yeah.
We're designed for this.
Yeah, I said to someone who's depressed, I said, are you sick or do you just hate your life? There's a difference. Okay, so we had to talk about trauma. That's another one I'd love to get into. We don't really have time now. Where do people find the book? Let's just put that and say the name of the book.
The Art of Impossible. So artofimpossiblebook.com. You can also come in through stevenkotler.com if you want to learn more about the Flow Research Collective and the work we do. Flow Research Collective.com. And the book's available, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, every bookstore you could possibly go to. Support your indies, et cetera, et cetera.
Steven, this is fun. I definitely had some micro flow at times. The hour's gone by. I hope you had a little bit of flow while we were chatting. I'm not used to guests who work at the same speed as I do, and I had a lot of fun with it. So I hope it was a good time for you too.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you so much for your interest. I appreciate it.